Ethan Caldwell was not an ordinary businessman. He was the owner of Skylux Airlines, one of the most well-known airlines in the country. People admired the company for its luxury and top-quality service, but Ethan was starting to hear different stories. Some passengers complained about rude staff, bad service, and an unfair attitude toward economy-class travelers. Ethan couldn't ignore these complaints anymore. He wanted to see the truth with his own eyes. Instead of relying on reports from his managers, he decided to go undercover. He would experience his own airline, just like an everyday traveler. No special treatment, no VIP lounges, and no one knowing who he was. He dressed in simple clothes, jeans, a plain shirt, and sneakers. He wore a baseball cap to hide his well-known face and booked an economy ticket on one of his flights. It was a domestic flight, only a few hours long, but it would be enough to observe how his employees treated passengers. When he arrived at the airport, he felt a mix of excitement and nervousness. It had been years since he had flown like a regular customer. Usually, he was surrounded by assistants, escorted through private security, and seated in first class. But today, he stood in line at the check-in counter like everyone else. The line moved slowly, and the employees at the counter didn't seem very interested in helping people. When it was finally his turn, the woman at the desk barely looked at him. "Name?" she asked in a flat voice. "Ethan Caldwell," he said, keeping his tone casual. She typed something on her computer, then printed his ticket and slid it across the counter without another word. Ethan noticed that she smiled and spoke politely to the well-dressed businessman ahead of him. But with him, she didn't even make eye contact. He brushed it off. Maybe she was just having a bad day. As he made his way through security, he saw more small things that made him wonder. Some passengers were struggling with their luggage while airport staff stood nearby, not offering to help. A mother with 2 young children was trying to organize their things, but no one stepped forward to assist her. Ethan felt a growing concern. These might seem like small things, but they made a big difference in how passengers experienced a flight. After security, he grabbed a quick snack and walked to his boarding gate. He sat down and observed the crew as they prepared for the flight. The flight attendants chatted among themselves, laughing and scrolling through their phones. Ethan didn't expect them to be serious all the time, but he wondered if they were paying attention to the passengers. When boarding started, he got in line and waited his turn. As he walked down the jet bridge, he took a deep breath. This was it. Soon, he would see exactly how his airline treated its passengers. What he didn't know was that this flight would change everything. Ethan walked toward the check-in counter with a calm expression, blending in with the other passengers. He was just another traveler today, not the billionaire owner of Skylux Airlines. The airport was busy, with people rushing in all directions, dragging suitcases and checking their phones. He adjusted his cap and stepped forward, eager to see how his own airline treated everyday customers. The check-in line moved slowly, and Ethan patiently waited for his turn. He watched as a well-dressed businessman in front of him approached the counter. The airline employee at the desk greeted him with a bright smile. "Good afternoon, sir. How can I assist you today?" she asked politely. She quickly processed his request, nodded along as he spoke, and even made a joke that made him laugh. Ethan expected the same courtesy when he stepped forward, but the moment the businessman walked away, the smile on the employee's face disappeared. She barely looked at Ethan and sighed as if she was already tired. "Name?" she asked in a flat, bored tone. "Ethan Caldwell," he replied, keeping his voice neutral. She typed his name into the system without making eye contact. There was no "How are you today?" or "Have a great flight." Instead, she printed his boarding pass and slid it across the counter without a word. Ethan hesitated for a second, then decided to test the service. "Excuse me, is it possible to change my seat?" he asked politely. The woman finally looked up, but with an annoyed expression. "All economy seats are the same. If you wanted a better seat, you should have booked first class," she said bluntly. Ethan raised an eyebrow. The businessman before him had also requested a seat change, and she had been more than happy to help him. Now she was acting as if Ethan's request was a burden. He nodded and took the boarding pass without arguing. This was exactly why he had come undercover. He wanted to see if his airline treated all passengers equally. And so far, it didn't seem like they did. As he walked away, he noticed other small signs of poor service. A mother struggling with a crying baby asked for assistance, but the airline staff ignored her. An elderly man who needed help lifting his suitcase onto the counter was met with impatient sighs. Ethan's concern deepened. His airline was supposed to be known for its excellent customer service, but this was far from what he had imagined. After passing through security, he grabbed a quick coffee and found a seat near his boarding gate. He continued to observe the employees. Some were focused on their work, but others stood in groups, chatting and laughing while passengers waited for assistance. Soon, the announcement for boarding was made. Ethan stood up, adjusted his bag, and got in line. As he approached the plane, he took a deep breath. If the experience at the check-in counter was already disappointing, what would happen once he was on the flight? He had a feeling things were about to get even worse. Ethan walked down the jet bridge, feeling a mix of curiosity and concern. The check-in process had already shown him that not all passengers were treated the same. Now, it was time to see what happened on the flight itself. As he stepped onto the plane, he was greeted by a flight attendant, or at least, that's what he expected. Instead, the woman standing near the entrance barely glanced at him. She was adjusting her uniform and chatting with another flight attendant. Ethan paused for a second, waiting for the warm greeting that he had always believed was part of his airline service. But the words never came. "Excuse me," he said politely, trying to get her attention. She turned her head slightly, her expression impatient. "Seat number?" she asked in a dull voice. 23B, Ethan replied. She gave a small nod toward the back of the plane. "That way," she said, then turned back to her conversation. Ethan raised an eyebrow but didn't say anything. He walked past first class, where the attendants were smiling and offering drinks to well-dressed passengers. The difference in treatment was already clear. As he made his way to the economy section, he noticed a mother struggling to put her bag in the overhead bin while holding her child. No one offered to help. When Ethan reached his seat, he found that someone had already taken the overhead space above it. He looked around for a flight attendant and saw one nearby. He waved slightly to get her attention. "Excuse me," he said. "Is there any space left for my bag?" The woman turned to him, her name tag reading Amanda. She had a sharp look in her eyes, as if she was already annoyed before he even spoke. "Overhead bins fill up fast," she said. "You should have stored it earlier." Ethan remained calm. "I boarded as soon as I was allowed to. Is there another space where I can put it?" She sighed loudly, then pointed toward the front. "Find a spot up there or put it under your seat. But next time, be faster." Ethan glanced at other passengers. Some were watching the exchange with quiet sympathy. A few looked uncomfortable, as if they had experienced the same kind of treatment before. He nodded, took a deep breath, and walked toward the front to find space for his bag. As he returned to his seat, he saw Amanda helping another passenger, a man in a suit, place his small briefcase in an overhead bin. She smiled at him and said, "Let me take care of that for you." The difference in her attitude was impossible to ignore. Ethan sat down, his mind already working. He had built this airline to provide excellent service to everyone, not just first-class passengers. But if this was how his employees acted when they thought no one important was watching, then something needed to change, and he was going to make sure it did. Ethan settled into his seat, adjusting his bag under the seat in front of him, since there was no space in the overhead bin. He took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. So far, his experience had been disappointing. The check-in process was unfriendly, and the flight attendants clearly treated certain passengers better than others. He had hoped things would improve once the flight took off, but he was quickly proven wrong. A few minutes later, the crew began making their final checks before takeoff. Amanda, The flight attendant, who had been rude to him earlier, walked through the aisle, glancing at passengers. When she reached Ethan's row, she stopped and frowned. "Sir, your bag needs to be fully under the seat," she said sharply. Ethan glanced down. His bag was already tucked beneath the seat, but a small corner of it was sticking out. He quickly pushed it in further. "There you go," he said politely. Instead of moving on, Amanda rolled her eyes. "Next time, make sure it's in place before we have to tell you," she muttered before walking away. Ethan clenched his jaw but said nothing. He didn't want to cause a scene. However, he was starting to realize that this flight was revealing a serious problem. Some employees lacked respect for their passengers. After takeoff, the flight attendants began serving drinks and snacks. Ethan noticed that Amanda was once again much friendlier toward certain passengers. When she served the businessman sitting a few rows ahead, she smiled and even made small talk. "What would you like to drink, sir?" she asked sweetly. "Oh, just a coffee," the man replied. "Would you like some extra cream and sugar? I'll bring it right over for you," she said cheerfully before moving on. But when she reached Ethan's row, her entire attitude changed. She barely looked at him as she handed him a drink without asking what he wanted. "Here," she said, setting down a cup of water on his tray table. Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Actually, I'd like some coffee, please." Amanda sighed as if he had asked for something unreasonable. "We only have a limited amount," she said. Ethan glanced ahead, where she had just offered extra cream and sugar to the businessman. "I noticed you were giving it out earlier," he said calmly. Amanda's expression hardened. "Look, sir, if you have a problem, maybe next time you should upgrade your ticket," she said in a low but firm voice. Ethan was stunned. He wasn't asking for special treatment, just fairness. Other passengers nearby had heard the conversation, and some exchanged uncomfortable glances. At that moment, Ethan realized how deep the problem was. It wasn't just small mistakes. It was a complete disregard for economy-class passengers. As Amanda walked away, Ethan made a decision. He wasn't going to let this continue. And soon, Amanda would find out exactly who she had been speaking to. Ethan sat in his seat, his mind racing. He had built Skylux Airlines with the goal of providing excellent service to all passengers, not just those who could afford first-class tickets. But what he had seen so far on this flight was troubling. Amanda, the flight attendant, had treated him with barely hidden irritation, while passengers who looked wealthy or important received smiles and extra attention. As the flight continued, Ethan decided to observe more carefully. He wanted to see if Amanda's behavior was just a one-time mistake or a pattern. It didn't take long to get his answer. A few rows ahead, a young mother was struggling with her baby. The infant was crying loudly, and the mother looked exhausted. She gently rocked the baby, whispering soothing words, but nothing seemed to work. Passengers nearby glanced over, some with sympathy, others with mild annoyance. Amanda walked down the aisle, her expression already showing frustration. When she reached the mother, she placed her hands on her hips. "Ma'am, you need to keep your baby quiet," she said in a sharp tone. The mother looked up, her face full of stress. "I'm trying my best," she said softly. "He's just tired." Amanda let out a sigh. "Well, other passengers are trying to rest. Maybe you should have brought something to keep him calm." Ethan felt his jaw tighten. He could see the hurt on the mother's face. Instead of offering help or even a kind word, Amanda had made her feel worse. A few minutes later, Amanda's attitude changed completely when she approached a man wearing an expensive watch and designer suit. He had pressed the call button, and Amanda rushed over with a bright smile. "Is there anything I can do for you, sir?" she asked sweetly. The man gestured toward his empty glass. "Could I get another drink?" "Of course. Let me bring that right over," Amanda said cheerfully. She even gave a small laugh at something he said. Ethan couldn't believe the difference in her behavior. She was capable of being kind and professional, but only when she thought someone was important. A little later, another passenger in economy, an older man, accidentally spilled a bit of water on his tray. He quickly grabbed a napkin to clean it up, but Amanda saw and frowned. "Be more careful next time," she said as she passed by, not offering any assistance. Ethan took a deep breath. This wasn't just one bad moment. This was how she treated passengers she didn't consider important. And it wasn't just Amanda. Other flight attendants weren't as rude as her, but they also didn't seem to care much about the economy class passengers. Ethan knew what he had to do. He had seen enough. This flight was going to change everything, not just for Amanda, but for the entire airline. And soon, Amanda was going to realize exactly who she had been mistreating. The flight was nearing its final hour, and Ethan remained quiet, watching everything unfold around him. He had seen enough to know that there was a serious problem with how his airline's employees treated passengers. Some were professional, but others, like Amanda, seemed to pick and choose who deserved kindness. Ethan leaned back in his seat, thinking about what he would do next. He had never liked using his power to intimidate people, but this situation called for something drastic. It was time to reveal who he really was. A few minutes later, the captain's voice came through the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, we will be landing shortly. But before we do, we'd like to take a moment to acknowledge a very special guest on this flight." Ethan's lips curled into a small smile. He had arranged for this announcement before the flight, just in case he needed to make a point. He turned his head slightly to see Amanda standing near the front of the cabin, adjusting her uniform. She had no idea what was coming. "We are honored to have the owner of Skylux Airlines, Mr. Ethan Caldwell, traveling with us today," the captain continued. "On behalf of the entire crew, we thank you for choosing to fly with us." A wave of silence washed over the cabin. Passengers exchanged surprised looks, and whispers filled the air. Ethan slowly removed his cap, revealing his face. Amanda's reaction was instant. Her body stiffened, and her eyes went wide. She looked at Ethan as if seeing him for the first time. A deep shade of red spread across her face, and she took an uneasy step back. Other flight attendants rushed forward with nervous smiles. One of them, who had barely acknowledged him earlier, now spoke in a bright, eager voice. "Mr. Caldwell, what an honor to have you on board. Is there anything we can do for you?" Ethan didn't respond right away. Instead, he looked directly at Amanda. Her confident, dismissive attitude from earlier had vanished. She swallowed hard, clearly realizing the weight of her actions. Passengers who had witnessed Amanda's behavior now watched with interest. Some of them smiled, as if satisfied that she was finally being held accountable. Others simply waited to see what would happen next. Ethan stood up slowly, stretching his legs. Then he met Amanda's nervous gaze. "I appreciate the announcement," he said calmly. "But honestly, my experience on this flight has been eye-opening." Amanda opened her mouth, but no words came out. "I've seen firsthand how some passengers are treated differently based on appearances," Ethan continued. "And I'd also noticed that kindness and respect seem to be reserved only for those who look important." The flight attendants, including Amanda, stood frozen. No one dared to interrupt him. Ethan sighed and shook his head. "That's not the kind of airline I built. And trust me, changes are coming." Amanda's face paled even more. She now understood the truth. This flight was not just another routine trip. It was a test, and she had failed. The air inside the cabin felt heavier now. The once chatty flight attendants were silent, their expressions filled with unease. Amanda, who had been so confident and dismissive earlier, now stood frozen, her hands nervously clasped in front of her. Ethan remained standing, letting the moment sink in. He could feel the eyes of the passengers on him, their curiosity and anticipation growing. Some of them had experienced Amanda's rudeness firsthand, while others had only observed it. But now, everyone knew who he was, and more importantly, what he had seen. Amanda finally found her voice, though it was shaky. "Mr. Caldwell, I didn't know who you were," she stammered. Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Does that mean you would have treated me better if you had known?" Amanda's face turned red. She opened her mouth to respond but quickly shut it, realizing there was no good answer. Ethan crossed his arms. "That's the problem, isn't it?" he continued. "You shouldn't be treating people with kindness just because of their status. Every passenger, whether they're flying first class or economy, deserves the same respect." A murmur spread among the passengers. Some nodded in agreement, while others exchanged knowing glances. One of the other flight attendants, a young man named Daniel, took a cautious step forward. "Mr. Caldwell, I'm really sorry if your experience wasn't up to standard," he said. His voice was steady but nervous. "That's not how we want our passengers to feel." Ethan studied him for a moment. Daniel had been neutral throughout the flight, not particularly rude but not particularly helpful either. At least now, he seemed to understand the weight of the situation. "I appreciate that," Ethan said, then turned back to Amanda. "But the real question is, do you understand?" Amanda looked down, unable to meet his gaze. Her fingers twisted together as she struggled for words. I didn't mean to be disrespectful," she said quietly. "I was just doing my job." Ethan sighed. "Your job isn't just serving drinks or enforcing rules. It's making sure every passenger feels welcome and valued. And today, I saw that you only treated certain people that way." Amanda's eyes glistened with embarrassment. She knew she couldn't argue against the truth. Ethan took a deep breath and glanced around the cabin. "This isn't just about one person," he said, addressing the entire crew. "It's about the culture we've created in this airline. Somewhere along the way, we lost sight of what really matters, treating all customers with respect. And that's something I plan to fix immediately." The passengers erupted into quiet applause. Some of them, like the elderly man and the young mother Amanda had mistreated, smiled with relief. They finally felt heard. Amanda nodded slowly, her shoulders slumping. She had no defense left. She had made her choices, and now she had to face the consequences. Ethan sat back down, his decision made. When the flight landed, real changes were going to begin. And Amanda's future with the airline. That was something he would have to carefully consider. As the plane began its descent, the tension in the cabin slowly settled. The passengers, who had been holding their breath during the confrontation, now whispered among themselves. Some looked satisfied, others curious about what would happen next. Amanda remained quiet, her usual confidence gone. She stood stiffly near the front of the cabin, avoiding eye contact with Ethan or any of the passengers she had mistreated. Ethan leaned back in his seat, staring out the window as the city below grew larger. He had come on this flight as a regular passenger, hoping to understand the true experience of flying with his airline. What he had discovered was more disappointing than he had expected. But at the same time, it was a wake-up call, one that was long overdue. The flight touched down smoothly, and as the plane taxied to the gate, Ethan already knew what his next steps would be. The moment the seatbelt sign turned off, passengers began gathering their belongings, chatting about what had just happened. Some of them stole glances at Ethan, wondering what he would do next. A few moments later, the flight attendants lined up near the exit, preparing to say goodbye to the passengers. Amanda stood among them, her hands clasped in front of her. She looked nervous, like someone waiting for a verdict they knew wouldn't be in their favor. Ethan stepped forward, pausing near her. She hesitated before finally speaking. "Mr. Caldwell, I'm sorry," she said in a quiet voice. Ethan studied her for a moment, then nodded. "I appreciate that," he said, "but apologies alone don't fix problems. Actions do." Amanda swallowed hard, nodding in understanding. She had spent the entire flight believing she was in control, but now she realized she had been careless with her words, her tone, and most importantly, her attitude toward passengers. Ethan turned to the rest of the crew. "This isn't just about one flight," he said. "It's about the way we treat people every day. Things are going to change, starting now." He didn't raise his voice, but his words carried weight. The other flight attendants nodded, understanding that the days of selective kindness were over. As he stepped off the plane, Ethan felt a sense of purpose. His first stop would be a meeting with the airline's leadership team. New training programs, better accountability, and a renewed focus on customer service would be put into place. No passenger should ever feel like they were less important just because of where they sat. Outside the terminal, a few passengers who had witnessed everything approached him. The young mother, still holding her baby, gave him a grateful smile. "Thank you," she said softly. "Not everyone would have stood up for us." Ethan returned her smile. "Everyone deserves respect," he said. "And from now on, I'll make sure they get it." As he walked away, he knew this flight had been the beginning of something bigger, a new chapter for his airline, where every passenger was valued equally.